one of the things that I think is really crucially important for Americans to grapple with is the history of slavery and freedom. And I think it's important for historians and the public to understand how historians have changed over time. In this session, how did this session help us understand how historians have rethought, rewritten, reevaluated their understandings of slavery and freedom in America?
Part of this is the realization that what historians said about slavery had such an impact on public culture, and how for a long time the dominant way that slavery was taught and studied was through the metaphor of the plantation as a school. Mm-hmm. And in fact, historian Ulrich Phillips, very influential in the early 20th century, right on through the 1950s, said that the plantation was a school and the children were let out too early. Mm-hmm. And when you think about what that means, that for over a half a century, what white Americans thought that Black Americans looked like at emancipation, this shaped ways people thought about the impact of slavery, and it also shaped the way people thought about the Civil War as something that was tragic rather than heroic. So it was crucial first to change what we thought about slavery, and then to change our interpretation of emancipation and Reconstruction.
And I think in some ways, what's so powerful is that when the museum began, we did surveys around the country. And the number one thing people wanted to better understand was slavery and freedom. And the number one thing they didn't want us to talk about was slavery and freedom. And so for the museum, this was a crucially important session because it basically helped people understand not only how historians have changed, how suddenly we went from looking at the plantation to looking at the enslaved, to looking at the enslaved in different ways, to beginning to understand the complexity of gender and location. And so it really, in my mind, enhanced the conversation and would encourage the public to realize how central slavery was and continues to be to America's identity, America's sense of who it is, and that, in essence, if we want to grapple with so many of the issues that we face today, we've got to better understand the impact and the continuing legacy of slavery.
And of freedom. And I think that's what, by having this session focus on slavery and freedom, what we did then was we were able to center that process of becoming free, which I'm hoping will enable teachers to use these materials to talk about the Civil War as a war of liberation, and to talk about the limitations as well as the accomplishments of emancipation, and maybe even help students to understand the possibility that maybe we should have a national holiday for the day that the 13th Amendment was finally ratified.
I think that notion of helping people understand what a major transition that was from slavery to freedom, and to help people understand how to think about Reconstruction and to think about the possibilities of Reconstruction, the possibilities of freedom, and then what were the limits of that. In some ways, what I think this session did was it would encourage the public to realize that it's an unfinished revolution, and that to be able to understand that freedom just doesn't happen, and that amazing transition took generations, and some would argue it's still unfolding. And so I thought that, again, this notion of being able to say, here's a historical moment, but it's also continuing to shape who we are as Americans today.
Thanks for having that first wonderful session. I'm Eric Foner from Columbia University, moderating this second session on slavery and freedom. I want to begin by, again, thanking the organizers of this excellent conference. We all know how much work went into putting this whole thing together, so thanks very much to those from the museum and the American Historical Association who have been so active in getting this conference organized. 2 weeks ago, I gave my last class at Columbia University, and I'm now riding off into the sunset of retirement. And so I ask if you will indulge me for just a minute as I reflect briefly on my own experience in relation to this field of African American history, which is sort of emblematic of many of the things that have happened in the last couple of generations. I grew up in a family in which African American history, although utterly ignored in the school education that I got in grade school and high school, nonetheless, the black experience was considered in my family central to American history. Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois were friends of my family. I still have a photo my mother gave me of myself at age 2 sitting on Paul Robeson's shoulders, which at age 2 probably seemed like a very long way up. He was a big guy. My uncle, as you know, my uncle Philip Foner was very prolific in the fields of labor history and African American history. My father, Jack Foner, also a historian, published a book on the black military experience. Like Clay Carson, who mentioned this last night, I took part in the March on Washington of 1963, but I guess I'm older than he is, so I also took part in the much less well-known March on Washington, I think 1957, not well-known part of our history. As an undergraduate at Columbia, I was lucky enough to take my first history course with the legendary teacher there, James P. Shenton, who assigned Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America in our seminar on the Civil War era, even though the chairman of the department told him that that was just not done at an Ivy League institution. In 1969, I taught the first course in African American history ever given in the over 200-year history of Columbia University, so the field was just beginning to get going outside the black universities, where it had always existed, of course. And among the students in my classes over the years of whom I'm very proud were Eric Holder, former Attorney General. I gave him a B. I think that was a sort of respectable grade back then. And I think President Obama recently issued an executive order raising that grade to an A. And among my students, my former students here at the conference are Rita Roberts and Stephanie Smallwood, who are blogging away at this moment, I think. Barbara Ransby, who we saw in action last night, and it won't surprise you that when she was an undergraduate, she kind of split her time between excellent historical work and organizing to get Columbia to divest its holdings in companies that were connected with South Africa. So she was a student activist from the very beginning. And Leslie Harris, who's also on our program, was one of our students. And I chaired the committee later on that established the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia and hired as our first director the late and much lamented Manning Marable. All of this is just to say is why I really want to tip my hat to Lonnie Bunch and his co-workers, because this museum that is going to open soon is really a dream come true for all of us who have labored in this vineyard of African American history for a long, long time. So thank you, Lonnie, and everyone working with you. So now that the first panel has settled the question, who is Black America, this panel has to decide what the narrative paradigm is that best structures African American history. As you all know, one of the most influential works in this area in the 20th century was John Hope Franklin's textbook, From Slavery to Freedom. That is a simple, compelling idea, from slavery to freedom. It suggests that emancipation is the pivot of the black experience and perhaps of the whole American experience. There was also an alternative textbook out there, which many of you are familiar with, by Meyer and Rudrick, From Plantation to Ghetto. That suggests a somewhat more downbeat kind of history, right? One form of exploitation succeeded by another form of exploitation. But I think it's fair to say that the slavery to freedom narrative has been the dominant one, although under considerable challenge lately. In the current issue of the Journal of Southern History, the historian Carol Emberton has an article, Unwriting the Freedom Narrative, which is sort of a review essay of recent books that challenge the celebratory account of From Slavery to Freedom. Books like Jim Downes's Sick from Freedom, Stephen Kantrowitz's More Than Freedom, Stacy Smith's Freedom's Frontier about unfree labor in the West. So one of the things I hope our panelists here will enable us to discuss is if this familiar slavery to freedom paradigm still makes sense as a way of understanding the trajectory of black history, and why at this moment, when people might want to feel celebratory, we are coming to the end of the second term of the nation's first African-American president, as everybody knows. How come so many historians are more interested in the limitations of emancipation and its aftermath than celebrating the transition? That's one question. Another one is, what are the implications for our understanding of slavery and freedom, of the trend toward globalizing American history and African American history, and also emphasizing the connections between slavery and capitalism, which we will hear about shortly. When the interpretive focus becomes so broad, so global, so abstract, how can individual historical actors be factored into the story? What role can slave resistance, for example, play in a story which is operating at the global level? And then there's the question of Reconstruction and how we ought to think about that period right after the end of slavery. Should it be viewed primarily as an episode in the history of American democracy, as Du Bois saw it? Should it be viewed as a purely Southern event? What happens to the African-American component if we expand it, as is now being done, to include the West and expand its time frame? Does decentering the South reduce the importance of that era for African-American history? And finally, how does this era of slavery and emancipation exist today in public consciousness? In movies, in memorials, in flags, in museums like these, and how should we commemorate it in historical museums? Well, anyway, these are all big questions, but we have a panel of big thinkers who can look at them, and I'm just their biographies and photographs. Some of the photographs, a little antiquated, are in the booklet. In the booklet that we have, I'm not going to repeat their bios. This is the order in which they will speak. Number one, Walter Johnson from Harvard University. Number two, Brenda Stevenson from UCLA. Unfortunately, Brenda was stuck in Berlin yesterday. She was supposed to fly in. Her plane was canceled. She's in the air as we speak. So I will read her remarks, secondly, unfortunately. Third, Thavolia Glymph from Duke University. And fourth, Annette Gordon-Reed from Harvard History Department and Law School. So we will give them each, as Ira Berlin called it, a sort of fat 10 minutes. And I turn the floor over to Walter Johnson.
Thank you to Eric Foner. I can't say anything as dramatic as I was raised on the shoulders of Paul Robeson. I did, however, once meet Eric Foner. Thank you to the sponsors and to Dana Schaefer and Elizabeth Elliott. It's an honor to be here. and to reacquaint myself and to meet so many of the people who are my heroes. I want to acknowledge particularly Nell Painter, my advisor, who was the first person who helped me think through the fact that if we're actually going to try to write African American history, we need to imagine that we're going to have to reconstruct the very categories of historical analysis around the historical experience of African and African American people. And that's an idea that I think has been shared and expressed by a lot of the folks in this room, but it was from Nell Painter that I first learned that. I want to try today to do that a little bit around the question of freedom and to try to think through a notion of freedom and to figure out how a certain kind of, I would say, a foreshortened version of freedom has shaped the historiography of slavery. I'm obviously going to have to pick up the pace. Brenda sent me a secret text which said, I actually get her time. But I don't think Eric got that one. So, I want to begin from a familiar statement. The statement is, and you could find this in one variety or another in a lot of these sort of standard texts on history, the statement is that slavery dehumanized enslaved people. And I think there's a lot of problems that unfold from that statement. I think there are analytical problems, and I think there are ethical problems that unfold from that statement. So I want to very briefly, I'm going to try and do everything briefly and stop saying I'm going to do it briefly. I think part of the problem with that statement is that the institution of slavery is one of an almost infinite variety of the terrible and inhumane things that human beings do to one another. And so I think to cast it as the opposite of what it is that human beings do is to misunderstand the character of human being. I think there's an implication of permanence in the notion of dehumanization that is baleful. I think that it is much more productive to think of the condition of enslaved humanity, of what it means to be a human being under the conditions of slavery. And I also think that many of the terroristic and perverse pleasures of slaveholding relied upon the notion of a human victim. I think that there is a deep ethical problem in historians of the 20th and 21st centuries casting doubt on the humanity of past historical actors, particularly subaltern historical actors, and it does raise the question of who gets to say when these African American people were human again. Finally, I think it takes a statement about our own perceived ethical distance from the perpetrators, our ability to cast them as inhuman, and takes that and attributes it as if it is a characteristic of the victims, right, that they have been dehumanized. And so I think there's an essential difference between arguing that somebody acted inhumanely and arguing that the effect of their action was to dehumanize the victim. Behind all of these slippages, I think there is an unacknowledged ethical premise. I'm going to read you a quotation from a, I guess not so recent, but very influential book on history. And I read it not because it is particularly obtuse, but I think it's particularly emblematic of presumptions which frame a lot of work done on the history of slavery, and indeed have framed some of the work that I have done on the history of slavery. Whenever masters, whether implicitly or explicitly, recognized the independent will and volition of their slaves, they acknowledged the humanity of their bond people. Extracting this admission was, in fact, a form of slave resistance, because slaves thereby opposed the dehumanization inherent in their status. So if you read that, that's a single, very, very powerful sentence which collapses three different things. It collapses the notion of humanity into the notion of resistance, right? People are human when they resist. That leaves aside then the question, for instance, of despair. Right? What about enslaved despair? What about enslaved suicide? And correspondingly, we see that we do not have histories of these things in the way we should, again, with the exception of Nell Irvin Painter's Soul, Murder, and Slavery. The other thing that it does is it leaves out the possibility of enslaved flourishing, right? For reasons that we can all understand the minute that I say the words happy and slave together. Nevertheless, we have no history of laughter in slavery. We have a very, very thin history of love, right? So there's a collapsing of enslaved humanity into resistance, i.e. into the terms of enslaved people's relationship with slaveholders. Finally, there's a collapsing of the notion of resistance into independent will and volition. And that's the thing that I'm going to focus on the most. There's a collapsing of the notion of resistance into a particular form of what I would call subjectivity, the notion that what a human being is a person who makes independent decisions. That is a notion of human subjectivity that I'll note would be utterly foreign to Nat Turner. Nat Turner doesn't think that he's a person who has independent will and volition. Nat Turner thinks that he is the fingertip of God's providence, right? So he acts out of a notion of sacred duty rather than independence. So I just want to call that into question. Now, the thing that I guess I want to concomitantly say is that that figure of freedom is the very figure of freedom that is being promulgated all over the world by the European imperial slaveholding powers as the notion of freedom. It's a notion of freedom, freedom based on the rights of the citizen, that is historically framed by the problem of slavery and empire. So what I'm interested in trying to do in the slightly longer and more convoluted paper that I posted is to try to rework our notions of justice and human rights in the light of the history of slavery. It's really to try to treat slavery as the central moral event of modernity, to try to re-theorize justice and freedom from the perspective of slavery and really from the perspective of the continent of Africa. Doing so would require us to give a thoroughgoing account of what sort of institution slavery was and of what we think of the enduring ethical and historical relevance of slavery, which I'm planning to do in the remaining 3 minutes that I have. Following Cedric Robinson and W.E.B. Du Bois, and this is the Du Bois of Black Reconstruction as well as the Du Bois of Darkwater and the extraordinary essay on the souls of white folk, which if you have not read, you should just clear out right now and go read that rather than listening to the rest of what I at least have to say. I want to try to think about slavery as a system of racial capitalism. I want to try and think about the histories of economic exploitation through capitalism and racial domination through negrophobia as concomitant and as in fact identical to one another in many ways. It would take a lot of work to actually substantiate for you the notion that when we say the word capitalism, we should always say the word slavery, that they're not two different things. So that's why I want to say racial capitalism, but I'll give you just a few examples of why I want us to try to push, to insist upon saying racial capitalism, right? To insist upon an analysis of anti-blackness alongside our analysis of, and ineluctably inextricable from our analysis of capitalism. If you cannot use the word capitalism to describe the exportation for sale of 12 million people across the Atlantic Ocean, I'm not sure what usefulness the term has. So it seems to me that's the first challenge to the history of capitalism that does not acknowledge slavery as its central aspect. But one could then just simply map what we take to be the capitalist economy of the 19th century, and particularly of Great Britain, the definitive capitalist economy for those who want to define the term capitalism as if it was something that only happened in Manchester. If you actually make a map of that economy, you recognize it's an agricultural economy based on cotton that works on a yearly basis of advances. What happens is that cotton merchants in Liverpool make credit advances to planters in Louisiana, right? And those advances are made against the cotton crop. Well, sometimes the cotton crop comes in short, and sometimes what's happened then is that the advance made from Liverpool to Louisiana is not going to be paid off by the cotton that actually comes in. When that happens, there's a debt, and that debt has to be collateralized. And there are two ways of collateralizing debt in the Atlantic system of slavery in the 19th century, which everybody acknowledges the 19th century to be the moment where capitalism dawned in the cotton mills in Lancashire. The two modes of collateral are human beings and land, right? Well, human beings, obviously, it's not that slavery was capitalist. I mean, that enslaved people were the capital, right? The other form of collateral is land, and that's land that as we could, hear related to the paper that Ty and Miles gave this morning, that is land that's Native American land, that is expropriated land, right? Most notably, that land is covered by the Supreme Court decision Johnson versus McIntosh of 1823. My colleague, Professor Gordon-Reed, could probably correct whatever I'm going to say, but Johnson versus McIntosh is a foundational case in the history of United States property law. So if you go back to the origins and you try to, to really go back and figure out why is it that we actually legally own the things that we own, at the bottom of that legal trail, you'll find Johnson versus McIntosh. Johnson versus McIntosh is a case which says that Native Americans are not allowed to sell land to individual white settlers. All Native American land must be aggregated under the auspices of the federal government in order to be distributed through a capitalist land market to white settlers. So what that does is at the very bottom of property relations in the United States, there is imperialism, racial difference, and capitalist mode of distribution, right? That's the foundation of our property law. So those are the, some of the pathways that I would try to use to elucidate this notion of racial capitalism, which I can do more in the questions, and it's elucidated a bit better in the paper that's posted on the website. What I want to do in the little bit of time I have remaining is just outline what I think the benefit would be of bringing slavery to the center of our question of what we call human rights or of global claims of justice, to understand slavery and this particular version of slavery that I've just tried to outline as the central moral event of modernity. First of all, it mounts its critique of injustice from the standpoint of Africa and the standpoint of Native America, from the standpoint of the global South rather than the global North, not from Europe. It does not, it makes Europe a central problem rather than as the site of the elaboration of notions of justice. Secondly, and this goes to some of the questions earlier, it's focused on the question of extraction and distribution between classes and areas of the world. So it takes the experience of the dark working class of the world and generalizes that as the experience we should use to characterize justice claims everywhere. It's historically deep. It analyzes and emphasizes ways in which present distributions of privilege and objection are related to past patterns. It is in that way, I think, a powerful antidote to colorblind liberalism, right? It says, no, we need to think about historical distributions, not simply contemporary distributions. Emphasis on slavery as a paradigmatic wrong would entail a notion of justice predicated on questions of gender and sexuality, on the ways that reproductive invigilation and natal alienation, the subordination of the social reproduction of one group of people to the purposes of another, were a core feature of the human wrongs of slavery. So it would bring questions of gender, reproduction, sexuality to the heart of our question of global justice. Finally, and I think that this is important, I mean, if one's really to understand the history of capitalism and slavery, one would try to write a history that relates the instrumentalization of human being to the instrumentalization of nature, to think about the way that the development of cotton plants were genetically hybridized and developed to meet the capacity of a human hand, and human beings were ethically and violently narrowed down to the capacities of their hand under slavery. So those two things, the instrumentalization of human being and the instrumentalization of nature, are directly related to one another. And so I think that finally we would want to imagine that from the standpoint of slavery, from the standpoint of the history of slavery, we could theorize a notion of global justice that is vigorously environmental, but that is not simply green. It's not predicated on a politics of sustainability of the standing order. It is theorized according to a politics of sustainability of a future imagined more just order. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walter. Brenda Stevenson's paper is entitled, "Us Never Had No Big Funerals or Weddings on the Place, Ritualizing Black Family in the Wake of Freedom." Searching back over the long arc of her life, Dora Franks was clear in her complaints about her bonded life in rural Alabama and Mississippi. Enslaved people were not allowed to create, celebrate, legalize, protect, or ritualize family life. According to her, there were few ritualized events that signified the beginning and end or even the existence of kinship ties. Us never had no big funerals or weddings on the place, didn't have no marrying of any kind. Folks in those days just sort of hitched up together and they called themselves man and wife. On the surface, Dora Frank's observations might not appear to be correct, or at least not generally applicable. With regard to marriage, certainly some enslaved blacks in the South jumped the broom, and some even had elaborate weddings. Still, Franks's comments do indicate a more profound truth about the social identity and status of enslaved blacks. None of their weddings signified a legally binding marriage contract, and the actual bride and groom freely chose few of the designated aspects of their marriage rituals. Indeed, it was not unusual for slave owners to insist on certain details of the marriage ritual that turned the event into something of a minstrel show for a white audience's benefit. And while there is little doubt that many of these enslaved people who married, particularly those who did so of their own accord, typically found some meaning and even joy in the events that constituted that they were husband and wife, these rituals were fraught with the profound irony that defined the slave's life, the irony of being both person and property. No matter how elaborate or cursory the marriage ritual, enslaved husbands and wives were always aware of its devastating limitations. Slave masters and mistresses, however, viewed the slave marriage ritual in other ways, as a form of entertainment, the beginning of the birth of new slave property, as a way to demonstrate their benevolence, and as a form of disciplinary control through the threat of familial loss. Slave owners certainly did not conceive of the slave marriage ritual as a romantic, sacred, legally binding event, as ideally expressed in the propertied world of the Southern gentry. My talk this morning explores the marital rituals of black Southerners both before and after the U.S. Civil War as a window into the ways that African Americans marked freedom in the 1860s and beyond. with public and private ritualized events that designated and differentiated their new legal status, individual choice, and human dignity as unfettered men and women. When no longer a bondswoman, for example, the same Dora Franks who complained about having no family signifying rituals while slave made certain that her new free status included the markers of respectable, gendered, and familial behavior that had been denied her when they were enslaved. 2 years after the Civil War, Dora married freedman Pet Franks. Dora chose her own husband, married legally, and bore her children legitimately. She had an elaborate wedding followed by a big supper. Her husband, Pet, concurred with Dora's description of their rituals, noting, "When I was on the Cox place, I met Dora and us married. That was a big wedding and a big feast." Like so many others who struggle to define and live freedom after emancipation, family life as a free person for Dora and Pet Franks meant in part the exercise of legal and public familial ceremonies and rituals such as weddings. Unlike these marital performances that had occurred before emancipation, postbellum weddings pronounced to black families, communities, and the larger Southern world that freedmen and women now had a right to claim marital relations, to claim control over the intimate aspects of their bodies, to live under one roof, and to maintain their children. Temple Herndon, for example, was certain why at age 31 she was glad when the Civil War ended and freedom came. She and her husband Exeter could now live all the time together instead of the abroad arrangement they had endured while slaves. For her, freedom was fundamentally coded as a united family. "I was glad when the war stopped," she said, "because then me and Exeter could be together all the time instead of just Saturday and Sunday." Hundreds of thousands, if not more, couples who had been married while enslaved or wanted to marry after slavery ended did not hesitate to participate in new legally binding nuptials. To do so, they drew a line between slavery and freedom. Post-slavery wedding rituals also signified personal choice and were an opportunity for black men and women to openly display African-American romantic love and cultural aesthetics. Freedom, after all, also meant the ability to profess one's beauty, one's talent, one's emotion, and one's intellect, personal attributes that routinely had been denied, destroyed, or exploited during slavery. Among the confusing, complicated, and sometimes conflicting patchwork of instructions from various governmental agencies, missionary organizations, teachers, and former owners, most freed couples sought legitimacy for their marital relationships and their children. Those who had jumped the broom before emancipation went right to the point of why they chose to remarry after gaining their freedom. They wanted to ritualize their marriages in the manner that free people typically ritualize theirs, not as slaves. "My mother married at Thomas Pope's place," a former slave recalled, "and he had old man Ned Pearson, a black who could read and write, to marry them. He married lots of blacks then. After the war, many blacks married over again because they didn't know if the first marriage was good or not." Charlie Davis explained in a similar fashion, "My mammy and daddy got married after freedom because they didn't get the time for a wedding before. They called themselves man and wife a long time before they were really married." Willis Dukes was absolute about the legitimacy of his postbellum marriage, noting, "We didn't jump over no broom neither. We was married like white folks with flowers and cake and everything." As far as Dukes was concerned, because he and his bride shared the same marriage rituals as whites, their marriage had to be legitimate. Former slave Gus Clark was also emphatic. I have had 3 wives. I didn't have no weddings, but I married them according to law. My first 2 wives is dead." Mildred Graves recalled that as a slave, her mistress had given her a cast-off dress and she stepped over a broomstick. "But after the war, we had a real sure-enough wedding with a preacher. That cost $1. Mary Reynolds, who had also been married by stepping across a broom, noted, "After freedom, I got married and have it put in the book by the preacher." Those who decided and had the ability to marry as individual couples brought serious thought and planning to their manifestations of the marital bonds. Clothing, food, venue decor, audience composition, their vows, the license, the celebrant, and the dance party were all important items to consider in these marriage rituals. Many of these choices also spoke to the aesthetic values of late 19th century Southern blacks and their skills as designers, seamstresses, cooks, and speakers that they brought with them out of slavery into their new lives as free people. Some of these preparations also suggest the communal efforts and ties, black and white, that shaped Southern black life in the first decades after slavery ended. Postbellum brides, for example, indicated in the assemblage process of clothing and adornment for body, hair, hands, and feet those who were operative members of their communities and kinship networks as freed people. Some of this pre-wedding activity indicates as well active economic relationships between working white and black women at a time when fledgling local Southern economies were a burden for both. Other aspects of weddings that benefited from contributions, in quotes, also suggest ties across racial lines, some more cutting than others. Bunny Bond's employer, for example, donated her wedding cake. Bunny hardly was the only former slave whose wedding was subsidized by whites. Employers had good reason for lending a helping hand. Given the difficulty of retaining workers after emancipation, many were anxious to impress their employees, many of them their former slaves, with tokens of generosity that suggested they supported those black families who were loyal and good workers. Moreover, it placed whites in the position of economic superiority and encouraged the ever-popular myth of Southern paternalism. This type of help, as one might imagine, could be both a blessing and a burden. It indicated how involved former owners or employers remained in the personal lives of their black workforce, and it documented sustained black economic dependency. This kind of aid, therefore, barely disguised the lingering financial exploitation whites imposed on black laborers, leaving them little ability to fund their own wedding or to create new separate households. Black workers, in conclusion, also may have been able to leverage their employer's need for labor to get them to provide precisely the kind and amount of assistance they needed to have these elaborate marriage rituals.
Good morning. So the title of my talk is Between Slavery and Freedom, and I took Eric a bit seriously, but as you'll see, not completely. So I tried to follow some of his instructions. So one day on a Baltimore street corner, it was February of 1861, two black women were overheard discussing the state of the Union, the dispute between the North and the South. One of them said, quote, "Wait till the 4th of March, and then when I slap my mistress's face." March 4th, 1861 was no date snatched out of thin air. It was the day Lincoln was to be inaugurated. And on that day, in that event, the, quote, two negresses saw the opening of new political ground in the war against slavery. Unlike the incoming president, they prepared to lead a different war. He prepared to lead a war to reunite the country as a slave country. They represented the black Marylanders who made no, as Barbara Fields writes, made no detour through the middle ground, who had no doubt from the beginning what the central issue was. By the time the Confederacy had been defeated, slaves in this country had suffered massive defeats, but they had also won big and small victories. Those victories, more than the defeats, helped to redraw the map of the United States. So in 1864, when Celinda Johnson's name appears in a wartime federal roll, and she is described as, quote, citizen colored, that description registered a very small but a very big victory. Celinda Johnson would have to wait another 4 years before the 14th Amendment came and her citizenship was ratified. But that in 1864, an agent of the federal government listed her, a slave woman, as a citizen, signaled just how far the war to put down the slaveholders' rebellion had come, just how far the Union had been transformed, and in no small part due to the efforts of people like Celinda. Celinda, who had joined thousands, hundreds of thousands of slaves who fled the plantations and who forced a merger of the Union War and the Slaves' War. Like many mergers even today, it was a messy coming together. It was always fraught with the possibility that both or one side or the other would withdraw from the merger. But slave resistance in support of emancipation and the Union redirected both the course of the war and emancipation. And as most of you know, Lincoln admitted as much in his famous letter to the citizens of Springfield, Illinois, who had opposed his issuing the proclamation. He told them in no uncertain terms that they could, quote, fight on to save the Union exclusively. But he also reminded them that he had issued a proclamation to help them in saving the Union. And here, of course, he was talking in particular about the role of Black men in the Union Army, that their service and their freedom were inextricably linked. And he would not take the proclamation back because he wrote the party who would elect a president on a war and slavery restoration platform would lose the colored force, and that force being lost would be, the Union would be powerless. Lincoln increasingly understood also, as did Congress and as did Union commanders in the field, that women, Black women, the mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters of Black soldiers would have to be offered the same deal, freedom. When Negro women and children are left behind, Sherman wrote, they become a fruitful source of trouble, indeed. Over the past 4 decades, scholars have demolished the long-standing argument of historians that portrayed slavery as a benevolent institution and sidelined the contributions Black people made to Union and to freedom. We no longer tolerate such nonsense as that by Robert Cotterill, a founding member of the Southern Historical Association, who wrote that the slaves' working hours were long but not strenuous, and from a psychological side, since he had never known freedom, he looked upon slavery not as a degradation, but as a routine. We also would no longer tolerate such nonsense as John C. Calhoun's assertion that slavery was, quote, a mercy. Despite, however, the large body of revisionist scholarship that has explored in great and gritty detail the process of emancipation, we still are struggling with the question of what came next, the question of what former slaves got in return, what freedom meant, and is now a hotly contested question among scholars. And I want to talk about this question a bit, and this is where the focus of my remarks are. Some scholars now have concluded, it seems, that slavery and the Civil War were so bad, so damaged to Black people, that when freedom came, they could hardly stand on the ground of freedom. Some seem to be asking, did freedom even ever come? Certainly the slow and often tepid response of Lincoln's administration to what was a humanitarian crisis surrounding Black people and Black refugees represented to Black people huge obstacles in their bid for freedom. This response contributed wittingly and unwittingly to the violence and protracted nature of emancipation But once the federal government had embraced emancipation, whether it was tepid or not, a major breach had occurred in the nation's commitment to slavery. And so I want to make two important points to counter some of the recent scholarship that Eric mentioned, in particular a recent article in the Journal of Southern History. The vast majority of Black people did not die in the Civil War. They lived. They fought to live. They put past struggles into play in the formation of a radical politics that would inform the post-war struggle. On this point, we could go back to the work of Tom Holt, who's argued compellingly, quote, that if the master confronted the slave from the safety of a mobilized white political community, the slave stared back. They stared back from the slave quarters that were also mobilized, however brutalized and ravaged by the slave trade and arbitrary rule. We can understand this best perhaps by beginning with the recognition that enslaved people expected to fight. They expected that they would have to fight for their freedom. They understood that the brutality that had come with the making of slavery would accompany its unmaking, that they would die and suffer, many would, before any got their freedom, that their families would be again torn apart. As they gathered up their families to flee the plantations, they knew they were in for, quote, what one Union officer said, harder times. While the 150th anniversary of the Civil War has now passed, and for many of us, thank God, and scholarly attention has turned to the post-war amendments, the work of figuring out what freedom meant remains unfinished business. Civil War refugee camps are one place where we could take the temperature of this question. The movement and displacement of some 500,000 enslaved people condensed over the space of 4 years has no parallel in U.S. history. The domestic slave trade, of course, had moved some 1 million, but that was spread out over 70 years. So uprooted in the midst of war, enslaved people and free people experienced trauma, the trauma of families broken apart and shattered by violence. They experienced new disease environments and grueling new regimes of labor. But they also experienced more. And most of these people who ran away and ended up in refugee camps were women and children. The fugitive history of these women and children, their experience as refugees in refugee camps, and the punitive federal policies they faced are important to understanding what freedom meant. Civil War refugee camps were spaces of trauma, containment, discipline, surveillance, and the redeployment of notions of purity and pollution. So we might work to extend, for example, Steve Hahn's critical intervention about how, quote, languages of civilization and of race and radical prospect resonated with one another and contributed to the logic and choreography of reservations and segregation in the American West. And how this is sort of a proving ground for segregation and the separation of Black and Native people. So I want to take that up and to argue that we might extend this proving ground to the Civil War. Some of the men who played leading roles in the war against Native Americans received their basic training in the Civil War against African American women and children as overseers of refugee camps, where ideas about racial containment, contamination, and colonization circulated freely. Black women in refugee camps fought mightily against these notions, and they built communities in the camps. They played a large role in ensuring that more people made it to freedom than did not. There would be tragic losses. There would be losses that had long-term economic, political, social, and psychological consequences. There would be women like Margaret Ferguson who came into a refugee camp emaciated and with a gangrened leg and foot, her tibia partly exposed and destroyed, and who had her leg amputated. There would be women also like Missouri Lewis, who, from the perspectives of slavery and life in a refugee camp, decided to abort her child just as she was making it to freedom. These were hard decisions, decisions that make sense only in the context of the hard road to freedom. They're also the sort of decisions that revisionist historical scholarship does not like, does not typically celebrate. Today, looking at this evidence, some historians would see them as proof of our need to temper our judgment that emancipation came. Some would see them as suggesting that freedom was too hard for Black people to make it onto the ground. The making of freedom was too hard for Black people to make it on the ground of freedom and do something more to extend the wars that they had been fighting. And I want to ask that we back off of that we think too about Emmeline Anderson, who was a refugee and who worked to help other Black women refugees survived, and how they built new communities in refugee camps. I want us to step back and remember Anna Ashby, who was born a slave in Kentucky and who made it to freedom, and who by 1870 had joined the exodus to Kansas with her husband and children. I want us to step back and to remember that it mattered that the losses and violence suffered during the war came on the heels of a centuries-long business model in the United States that had fostered and celebrated what Walter Johnson calls the unfathering, the unmothering, and the misnaming of enslaved people. That emancipation did not end this kind of destruction, but it did mandate that this nation would have to define freedom anew. Making freedom was deadly work, but we risk doing a fundamental disservice to the difference it made when we make a hard turn in a direction that suggests that it accomplished too little to matter much. Like all wars, this war generated misery and death, and it did not leave untouched non-combatants who had no arms, who had no battlefield plans honed through the professional study of the history of war. No matter how hard it was to make, freedom made an important difference. There had been and would be in the years to come other wars over slavery, other places where slavery's destruction was achieved through force of arms, other places where the process of emancipation was prolonged and bitterly contested, other places where war generated refugees and atrocities, other places where slaveholders would be forced to their knees. The American Civil War was not exceptional in these regards, but the history of the battle for freedom in this country still remains to be fully integrated in its national and global dimensions, and I won't go into that here because I know I'm out of time. I want to end, though, with this idea that comes in the work of many historians, and the quote I have is from Hahn, that ordinary people did ordinary things under the most difficult circumstances. No, I'm sorry. That doesn't come from Steve. That comes from Tom Holt, I believe. Enslaved in the border state of Missouri and only 60 miles from the Union stronghold at St. Louis, Louisa Alexander was out of the reach of the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation. But she wrote her husband she was convinced that freedom would come to her, but it would only come, quote, she wrote him, at the point of the bayonet. It was a resolution she welcomed, and it was a resolution through which she secured her freedom, and we ought to applaud that kind of resolution. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this very, very vibrant conference. I'm always happy to share a stage with Eric, who's his normal feisty self, committing FERPA violations, giving out people's grades, talking about people's age in reference to their photographs. Who are you talking about? But I'm going to focus on my presentation on representations of slavery and memories of slavery in our everyday built environment. After the events in Ferguson, after the events in Charleston, as you well know, there was a sea change in attitudes, particularly on the parts of young people who wanted to write a different story or to question the story that had been told about the way we viewed memorials, symbols, things that represent slavery in our everyday life. And I'm sure you know across college campuses in this country as well as overseas, as a matter of fact, that this is a global effort to try to make a different understanding about the meaning of freedom by not accepting things that had been accepted as a matter of course. Many of the people in this audience, I mean, I'm sure all of you know of the famous notion that the South lost the war but won the peace, and that they were able to rewrite the story of what slavery had been about and rewrite and sort of set the terms of engagement between African American people in the South and whites in the South. And it was an engagement that basically got rid of, as Thavolia suggests, it was a monumental thing to get rid of slavery, and people, it was a great thing, and people savored that moment and struggled in it to try to make lives for themselves. But what also happened was that white Southerners were left to do pretty much what they wanted with what they considered to be their lost property. And in doing that, tried to bring things back as much to close to slavery as possible without it actually being slavery. And in the process, never really gave up the notion that their cause, their lost cause, was a good cause, erected monuments, flew flags, did all kinds of things to keep the memory of the Old South alive. And as David Blight has written, as I'm sure you well know, about the importance that was placed upon the notion of reconciliation between the North and the South. When that took place, black people were pretty much left out of that. So slavery was over. We have on paper the legal rights of citizenship, but not the actual accoutrements and actual status of citizens for a very, very long time, and it's something that we've been fighting for up until this particular moment. Now, after the terrible events that I mentioned, black students began to challenge the things around them that were memorializations, they thought, of slavery in ways that made their environment hostile. There was a different understanding. My generation grew up happy to be in these places and sort of ignored these things, didn't pay very much attention to them, but this is a different generation, and there are good points and bad points about that, and we'll talk about this in the question and answer period, but really a fierce determination to claim these spaces as their own. At my own university, there was a controversy about the shield, about a Harvard shield, a representation of a family. The family that had given money, or actually given land that was sold to start the Harvard Law School, had a shield with 3 bushels of wheat on it. And people didn't know. I went to Harvard Law School. I had no idea what that meant when we were there. Wheat, I guess it meant a symbol of fertility, a symbol of knowledge, and so forth. And then we found out that, of course, that this was the shield of the royal family that owned slaves in Antigua and also had slaves in Massachusetts as well. This story was told to Harvard students as they came into the first year. In the past few years, knowledge was not known when I was there. And a number of students decided that the shield should go. Across the seas at Oxford, Oriel College at Oxford, students complained about the statue of Cecil Rhodes, saying that Rhodes must fall. And then at Harvard, it was Royal must fall. And in other places, naming of buildings, Wilson at Princeton, Woodrow Wilson at Princeton, Yale, the controversy over John C. Calhoun, roiled the student body, and people suggesting that they shouldn't have to live in places, shouldn't have to be in places where people who had done these nefarious things were celebrated. Because if you name something after someone, it is in fact a celebration, however you cut it. There was pushback on this from people who said that history is history. And what you should do is not erase history by erasing these memories, perhaps contextualize things, perhaps, leave it as it is, or totally get rid of it. Those were the choices that were presented. I was on a committee that had to figure out what to do about the shield. And my decision, I think surprised a number of people, was that in this particular instance, I wanted to keep the shield but contextualize it change it, change the way people thought about it, saying that not all symbols are created equal, not all people are created equal in terms of their desire or their merit for celebration. It's a line drawing function, and we do that all the time. Some people could be in, some people could be out. There's some ways to contextualize things. Other things are just too awful to remain. And it's a difficult question about what goes in and what goes out, but that's the kind of conversation we ought to have. And as a historian, we typically feel, or the historians that I've spoken to about this, tend to be against the idea of what they would call erasing the past. But the question becomes, is removing something an erasure of the past? I thought, and I gave in my dissent, the notion that some people, after discussion, some instances, it's not, the shield to me was not like the Confederate flag, which is an odd notion that after you lose a war, you get to continue to fly your battle flag, that you get to erect monuments to people who basically fired against, killed Union soldiers, a flag that flew against the United States of America. We accept that because we accepted the reconciliation that David talks about as being necessary, more important than doing justice to African Americans. People, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, I said actually in this room at a conference, is a more problematic figure. Very, very racist. There's no question about that. A white supremacist. Not a good guy. At the same time, he was a person who essentially made modern Princeton, took it from being just a gentleman's club and made it a real academic institution. Princetonians might throw at me saying it wasn't before, but he actually made modern Princeton. He was a president, central to the school. John C. Calhoun, not so much. I said here that he could go, easily could go, and my advice wasn't taken on that. No, my advice wasn't actually given on that score. But these kinds of questions are sort of very much go to what we talked about this morning, this notion of Black identity and how Black people see themselves in this particular, at this particular moment, what we're willing to accept, what young people will accept. Part of this post-racial notion, which is problematic in some other ways, also comes along with it a very, very clear sense, a clearer sense probably than I had, of themselves as being Americans and wanting to create spaces for themselves. I don't want to use the term safe spaces, but spaces, I would say respectful spaces, is a legitimate question. And part of the struggle, there are many struggles after the end of slavery, but the struggle to belong, the struggle to be able to walk down the street, the struggle to feel comfortable in places is something that I'm very, very glad the younger generation has taken up. Someone was mentioned earlier, how do you bridge the gap between the generations, older generations and the younger generations who sometimes don't talk to each other, use different language. Members of the older generation say this is a trivial matter, there are much more important things to do. And there are always more important things to do, however you slice it, but it doesn't make it a trivial matter. How you're received, how comfortable you feel. Are you an American? Can you walk around and not have your history, your people discredited by the worship of people who did not think you were human beings? How do you do that? How do you settle it? And I don't have any easy answers to that, but I think it's something that complicates the question about Black identity, complicates our understanding of slavery and freedom, and how we're going to take all of this in by focusing in on the human dimensions, on the individual human dimensions that people, and the group dynamic, how people fit. And that is something that's very, very difficult, I think, to be settled on the question, certainly in the pages of academic histories. This is something that engages the public, and it's something that engages not only the African American public, it has to engage the white public as well. There has to be a confrontation, I think, a much more general and a much more persistent confrontation to the idea that citizenship is about whiteness. And I think that there's no question in my mind that that is something that is still a part of the generalized understanding that African American people are interlopers or people who were not supposed to be here, as people who are not supposed to be here don't have the same rights. And the sort of comfort level that a number of whites feel that they should have is not something that blacks should have. And I think I'm very, very happy that African American students, African American students have challenged that. It's not an easy answer. I am a historian. I don't believe in destroying the past, but I also don't think that it's necessary that changing the names of all buildings, removing statues, getting rid of the accoutrements of the Confederacy, having army bases named after Confederate generals, just an enormous concession to an ideology that we are still living under, and it's an ideology of white supremacy that I think the students and their supporters have been fighting against. So this is a battle that I don't think is going to be going away, and I'm actually glad that it was joined. Thank you.
Thank you.